Thank you very much for joining us here on this beautiful Perth winter's day, and welcome to the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre Housing Affordability in WA, the launch of its fourth report. This is A Tale of Tenures, the report to be launched today. My name is Gareth Parker. For the early birds, I host the 6PR breakfast program from 5:30 until 9 a.m. each morning on Perth's leading talk radio station. Also write columns for WA Today, and it's my great pleasure to be invited to be your MC for the launch of this fantastic and timely report today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Budja, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, some of whom you are going to meet very shortly. Could I welcome some distinguished guests, the Honourable Dr Steve Thomas, MLC, Shadow Treasurer from the Liberal Party of WA, Meredith Hammett, the member for Mirrabooka from Labor, to Sinead Taylor, the Executive General Manager of Bankwest, Mike Rowe, Director General of the Department of Communities, Rebecca Brown, Director General, Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation, senior leaders from Bankwest and Curtin University and across the West Australian business community, plus the next generation of leaders, students from St Andrew's Grammar School joining us here today as well. You're going to hear from a number of people this afternoon. This morning, old habits die hard. I say this morning about 100 times a morning. We are in the afternoon, including John Curtin Distinguished Professor Alan Duncan, the Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and Dr Amity James, Deputy Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute at the Curtin Research Centre, who are going to present their findings, plus our expert panel, Mike Rowe, who I mentioned just a few moments ago, Kath Hart, the Executive Director of the Housing Industry Association, Michelle McKenzie, the Chief Executive Officer of Shelter WA, and Professor Stephen Rowley, Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute at the Curtin Research Centre. Quick few bits of housekeeping. In the very unlikely event of an emergency, the venue has a two-tone alarm system, and I'm fair dinkum about this. The first warning tone will be a beep, beep sound. Upon hearing that tone, please identify your closest fire exit and prepare to evacuate. The second warning tone will be a whoop, whoop sound. So having done the making myself look silly portion, that is your cue to evacuate. Leave all personal belongings behind, make your way in a swift and orderly fashion to the nearest fire exit. Follow the instructions of venue staff as you vacate the building. Please take your time to identify your nearest fire exit, noting that it may be located behind you. This is where I do the flight crew. There and there. Please switch your mobile phones to silent right now if you haven't already. This is, as I said, the fourth in the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre's Housing Affordability series. And the BCEC have captured new data here to understand housing affordability in WA. And it really is the hot topic of the moment. It's the barbecue stopper. It's the subject of discussions on programs like mine and in all of the newspapers, because all of a sudden prices in the market are moving, and so everyone wonders what it costs to put a roof over your head, whether you are an owner, whether you are renting, whether you are an investor. So how has affordability changed over time and across our suburbs here in Perth and in Western Australia? How it impacts on a household's ability to meet their everyday expenditure needs, plus of course the elephant in every room, COVID-19. What impact has the pandemic had on our housing preferences? Are we looking for different modes of living in a post-pandemic world? There's brand new data from the 2021 BCEC Housing Affordability Survey, plus data from over 4,000 households spread not just across Western Australia, but New South Wales and Queensland as well. Later, when we get into the panel discussion portion of this event, you can get involved as well. And there are people from all sorts of industry sectors represented here today, and we've got a million people in the room who are going to have interesting perspectives on things. If you'd like a topic that you want to hear from our guests on, the way to do it is to get involved with the app called Slido. You can do it on your smartphone. You simply go to www.sli.do, Slido. If you enter the code #HousingWA2021, then you can submit a question and I'll be facilitating that discussion later. We'd love it if you'd share what you're up to on socials as well, at Bankwest Curtin, #HousingWA2021. I'd like to invite to formally welcome us to country, Auntie Vivian Hansen, Baladong Wajak Yorga from the Bibbulmun Nation, and Quaba Jukan to the stage to deliver what I hope you'll agree is an extremely meaningful and entertaining welcome to country this afternoon. Welcome.
You go first. I'll let you go first.
Yarn, Kobra Yoga Morich Maman, Gan European Yunakan Nicha Wajak Yunga Buja. Kora Balapin Mort Datni Nicha. Puruan Nunaka Mort, Word called Buja Buja, Balapa Datni Nicha. Nicha Buja, Ngalaka Buja. To all you good looking sailors, not so bad looking blokes, thank you very much for allowing me to be part of your day today. And I'm glad to come to this, what's named, to hear about housing, because when I was a kid growing up, I was actually born in a tent, and my parents didn't have to pay rate or rents on our ancestral grounds. So, thank you.
Well done. Kaya Nichinga Nunga Yoga Jurup Ngalak Datnyan Nicha Ngalaka Wajak Buja Kura Ngalaka Mortat Nyan Nicha Nichangala Buja Kura Yay Kayakul Ngalaka Mort Datnyan Nicha Ngalaka Court Ngalaka Wirn Ngalaka Corp Datnyan Nicha Buja. Good morning, everyone. As a Noongar Wajak woman, my heart is really happy to welcome you all here to Wajak Buja. Our families have lived here since time began. We will be here today and we will be here into the future. Our hearts, our spirit, and our blood and our tears are buried deep within this land, our Mother Earth, our Ngank, whom we call Mother. Thank you for having me here to do welcome. And I also take this opportunity to acknowledge our elders, past and present, who have made it possible for us to walk alongside everyone in society today. It's been a long, hard struggle. And as Mort said, we all know what it's like not to be living in a house. Many of us in my generation, we grew up on the old native reserves where we just had to build a camp, pitch a tent until the Department of Native Welfare decided to build transitional houses for our people. Just cement floors and metal walls with great big gaps in between where the wind blew, one little stove to keep us warm if we were lucky. And then, of course, they built better houses as time went on, and then finally people were housed by the Department of Housing. Many name changes within government, but I just still stick to what I grew up with, unfortunately. So I'm hoping that this report, I know I'm here to do a welcome, but sometimes it gives us an opportunity just to have a few little words in your ear about what it's like to struggle. And we know with COVID, things have changed immensely and money is not going to make a difference to our safety. So we have to make sure that our people have somewhere to stay. All society, rich, poor, black or white, we all need a home, we all need a roof over our head to keep our children safe so we can feed them, send them off to school so they can get an education. And to you people who've done the report, I commend you, and may it make a difference to our community out there. But welcome to Wajak Buja, and may your day be a good one. Thank you.
Please, as they round the corner, your attention to the Quabak Jukian dancers. Good afternoon.
Kaya everyone. Thank you Auntie Viv for that welcome to country. That was beautiful. We're Quabak Jukian and we're here on behalf of Carla Hart. So please enjoy what we have planned for yous. Wardang, 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 wardang. Wardang, 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 wardang. Pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out. Nee, nee, nee. Pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out. Nee, nee, nee. Pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out. Nee, nee, nee. Pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out. Nee, nee, nee. Pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out. Nee, nee, nee. Pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out, pulling me out. Nee, nee, nee. All right. Wula. Wula, 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 wula. Wula, 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 wula. All right, we've got a little dance for you called Nidja. So. Nidja nyunga puja kot, Nidja nyunga puja kot, Nidja nyunga puja, puja kot, puja kot, puja kot. Nidja nyunga puja kot, Nidja nyunga puja kot. Nidja nyunga puja, puja kot, puja kot, puja kot. Little bit faster. Nidja nyunga puja kot, Nidja nyunga puja kot, Nidja nyunga puja, puja kot, puja kot, puja kot. Nidja nyunga puja kot, Nidja nyunga puja kot, Nidja nyunga puja, puja kot, puja kot, puja kot. You. Wardang. Wardang, 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 jibber jabberling, wardang, 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 quap marrying, wardang, medital, wardang, jibber jabberling, wardang, 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 jibber jabberling, wardang, quap marrying, wardang, 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 jibber jabberling, wardang, 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 wardang. And one last dance we have for you is called I think the ladies know what this one is because all the bushes are being picked up. And this one is kura. All right. Kura murichoga, yeah, murichoga. Kura murichoga, yeah, murichoga, murichoga, murichmamen, murichnyunga, murichnyunga. Kura murichnyunga, yeah, murichnyunga. Kura murichmamen, yeah, murichnyunga, murichnyunga, murichnyunga. Kura murichmamen, yeah, murichoga. Kura murichmamen, yeah, murichoga, murichoga, murichnyunga, 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 murichnyunga. Woo! Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely fantastic. Please, another round of applause for Kwaba Jukan. Just a terrific demonstration, not just of culture, but I think also of how that culture is being strengthened over time and through generations. So well done to all of the dancers. Okay, next up here on the stage, I'd like to welcome the Executive General Manager of Bankwest. Please welcome Sinead Taylor.
Thanks, Gareth, and thank you to Auntie Vivian Hansen and the Kwaba Jukan dance group for that incredible welcome to country. It was really beautiful. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to extend that to respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people today. I'd also like to acknowledge the Honourable Dr Steve Thomas, MLC Leader of the Opposition in the Legislative Council, Shadow Minister for Treasury and Small Business and Member for the South West Region, Meredith Hammett, MLA Member for Mirrabooka, Rebecca Brown, Director General, Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation, and our guest panellists, Mike Rowe, Director General, Department of Communities. Bankwest has been part of the fabric of WA for more than 125 years, and we are deeply committed to improving the financial well-being of our customers and the communities that we serve. We're there for our 1.1 million customers all the time and whenever they need us, but most importantly when they are in vulnerable situations, and we pride ourselves on taking great care for customers that are in situations of vulnerability and great need. Now in its 9th year, our support for the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre forms an integral part of our ongoing support for the communities and the economy of Western Australia. The social and economic research produced by the Centre is helping to inform and shape debate and public policy on critical issues impacting both our great state and the nation. I'd like to welcome everyone here today to this report launch, the latest in the Focus on WA series, which presents findings from the 2021 Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre Housing Affordability Survey. I hope you agree that this report is both extremely timely and incredibly important in helping us to understand the current challenges around housing affordability and security in Western Australia. There's no doubt we're facing unprecedented times right now. The past 12 months have provided some serious challenges and also some really big opportunities in WA for both the economy and many sectors, and none more so than the housing sector. Recently, WA was named the most affordable state to rent and buy in Australia, and unsurprisingly to all of us who live here, rated in the top 10 places to live in the world right now. So we're seeing that optimism amongst first home buyers who are flocking to home ownership and the property market in their droves. And according to our latest attitudinal research, the dream of owning a home is well and truly alive. Interestingly, though, housing affordability is now a key consideration for prospective buyers, and they are more than ever considering more affordable options like apartment living and taking on houses that require renovation as an more affordable way of getting into the housing market. It's clear that the economic challenges of COVID-19 have impacted future home buyers, with many of them saying the pandemic has made a place that was affordable far, far more important. Whilst the industry is clearly experiencing significant growth, it's important to acknowledge that there are currently many Western Australians who are struggling to keep a roof over their heads. We know this from the regular conversations that we have with our customers through our branches and our contact centres, and it's important to us that we take personal, individualised approaches with every one of our customers to help them feel safe, secure and supported. I'm personally extremely proud of the Bankwest team for the care, courage and commitment that they show every day in support of our customers, especially those who are in vulnerable situations. We also know that the current housing crisis is putting real pressure on other community services, with Foodbank WA, one of our largest community partners, experiencing their busiest day on record a few weeks back at their Perth warehouse, with the demand set to only increase over the winter months. Whilst this is clearly a situation none of us planned for, it's something we can't turn our backs on. I know that today's report launch will create awareness of some of the critical issues facing the housing sector, which I hope will influence and shape policy to further support vulnerable homeowners in our community. Because if the past year or so has taught us anything, it's that when we come together and act collectively, we can rise and respond to any challenge. So thank you to Professor Alan Duncan, to Professor Stephen Rowley and Dr. Amity James for your work on this very timely report. I very much look forward to hearing from you shortly and the panel discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if I could just ask you to continue to enjoy your lunch if you haven't yet made your way through it. In a moment, I'm going to welcome up Professor Alan Duncan and Dr. Amity James to present the findings of this report. But the way this is going to work, they will take us through the very interesting findings, and I think they'll be thought-provoking findings. Then I'll welcome our other panellists up to the stage to join me. Please, if you haven't already, pull out your smartphone and jump onto Slido, and the website address is sli.do. And use that hashtag, which I just need to find again in front of me. It is #HousingWA 2021. You can submit your questions and we will get into that panel discussion coming up. But please welcome me and joining to the stage John Curtin Distinguished Professor Alan Duncan, the Director of the BCEC, and Dr. Amity James, the Deputy Director, Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, to present the BCEC Housing Affordability 2021 report.
Thanks, Gareth, and thank you all for joining us for today's launch. We really appreciate your interest in an issue that remains as relevant as ever, that of housing affordability in Western Australia. Amity and I look forward to sharing some of the main findings from the report, but before we do, we'd also like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands that we're meeting on today, and to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We'd also like to acknowledge our co-authors on this report, Adam Crowe and Stephen Rowley, who you'll hear more from in the panel session later on today. And particular thanks also to REWA, the Real Estate Institute of Western Australia, and particularly Dylan Canby for providing suburb-level data on housing transactions to support our work. So as you know, the world has faced the most extraordinary upheaval in the 2 years since the Centre's last Housing Affordability Report in 2019. COVID-19 has had an unprecedented impact on economic markets, and the need for radical stimulus measures became very quickly apparent to governments around the world. WA's housing market is no exception, with state and federal governments putting measures in place to stimulate construction and housing activity and supporting jobs within and outside the building and construction sectors. So the report that we're launching today looks at the current state of WA's housing market, including a special analysis of housing market activity and affordability over the course of the pandemic. And we ask whether or not COVID-19 has changed what people want from their housing choices. The report includes findings from the 4th BCEC Housing Affordability Survey, and I want to pass on to Amity now to explain a little bit more about the survey and to take you through some of its key findings. Amity.
Thanks, Alan. The BCEC Housing Affordability Survey is a longitudinal project. It began on a much smaller scale in 2013 when we collected data from around 800 households in WA. The survey has since expanded, and in this survey we collected 4,000 responses across WA, New South Wales and Queensland in April this year. Combined with the results from the 2015, 17 and 19 surveys, we now have a robust data set for the 3 states, which tells us about the perceptions of housing affordability, housing stress and the impact of housing costs on households over time. Responses to the survey were collected by a panel data company who used specific quotas to ensure respondent profiles were very similar and also broadly representative of the populations. In this report, we discuss the results of the 2021 survey and draw comparisons with previous years, across tenures and between different household groups. Aside from our core affordability questions, this year we focused on first home buyers as well as on the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that it had on housing. And so we're going to look at some of those results today as well. One way to understand housing affordability is to look at the proportion of household gross income spent on mortgage or rent payments. This figure that you can see here compares the outcomes across the 4 BCEC Housing Affordability Surveys for WA. Now, at a glance, you can see that there's a drop in the proportion of respondents spending 30% or more of their income on their housing costs over the last 2 years. And in the case of those paying more than 40% of their income on their housing costs, it's the lowest that we've recorded. This fall largely reflects the reduction in mortgage costs over the last 2 years due to falling interest rates. So broadly speaking, what we can see here is an improvement in housing affordability. However, this report is called A Tale of Two Tenures for a reason. When we analysed the data by tenure, we found that the proportion of households with housing cost burdens over 30% of income were higher for private renters than those with mortgages. Over the last 2 years, the proportion of private renters paying more than 30% towards their housing costs has remained the same, while the housing cost burden of those owning with a mortgage have fallen from 46% to 41%. And it's concerning that around a third of households paying over 30% of their income towards their housing costs said that they were forced into this position due to a lack of other available options. Housing affordability is not just about paying rent or a mortgage. It also includes the running costs of a house, so the utility bills, the maintenance costs. So in this survey, we asked respondents to rate how affordable their housing was to them. This slide describes the housing affordability perceptions of households across the 4 surveys. Overall, the last 2 years have seen big improvements in perceptions of affordability in WA, despite little wage growth. And you can see on the slide that the proportion regarding their housing as affordable has risen from 39% in 2015 to 53% in 2021. However, when we analyse the data again by tenure, we can see that in 2021, owning with a mortgage is perceived as being more affordable than living in the private rental sector. We found that 32% of private renters regard their housing as affordable. Now, this is up 2% on 2019 data, while the proportion of those regarding their housing as unaffordable has remained unchanged. So affordability in the private rental sector has changed very little over the last 2 years. And many of those respondents who regard their housing as being within that mid-range of affordability could potentially be pushed into that unaffordable category if their rents rise. By contrast, the perceptions of housing affordability by those who own their home with a mortgage have increased. However, this time it's up 6%, with 44% regarding their housing as affordable. Again, the proportion of people regarding their house as unaffordable has not changed. So, despite the improvements that we have seen in affordability, it does remain a tale of two tenures. A gendered analysis of the data found that women consistently fared worse than men on a range of key housing affordability outcomes. Women were more likely than men to rate their housing as being unaffordable. The biggest differences were in the number of women able to meet non-essential expenditure or able to save and invest, with a gap of 12% between men and women on that item. A high proportion of women than men were frequently unable to meet their housing costs, and they were more likely than male respondents to describe their financial situation as being poor or very poor. This picture has implications for women trying to save for a deposit and break into home ownership. So as one survey respondent said, as a single parent on a pension, working and studying to get a better career, it is not possible for me to save towards a housing deposit or any savings, as that money is spent on day-to-day life. Money is lucky to last the week. Alan, how does housing affordability differ across metropolitan and regional areas of WA?
Thanks, Amity. And yet location is a critical element in people's housing experience. This map looks at typical or median sales transactions during 2020 for houses across Perth's suburbs. The lower sales prices are shown in shades of blue. Mid-range prices are in yellow and orange, and red shades indicate higher sales prices. And the circles represent the number of sales in 2020 in sub-regional areas of Perth, measured against the scale on the left. And as you'd expect, the highest prices are for houses in the inner city, to the western suburbs along the Swan and along the coast, from the City Beach in the north down to Fremantle. Peppermint Grove, Dalkeith and Cottesloe sit at the top end of the market with medians of around 2 to 3 million. We're getting high volumes of at least 2,400 transactions in sub-regional areas to the north, with median prices of $580,000 in Joondalup and $385,000 in Wanneroo. Gosnells to the east and Mandurah to the south are more affordable, around $350K, but further from Perth City. And transactions for regional WA are generally more reasonable, with higher sales prices above $550K nevertheless in areas of Broome and Karratha to the north, and Bunbury, Busselton and Albany to the southwest and south of the state. Now, this map shows rental cost burdens across Perth Metro. The colours are set so that yellow picks out suburbs with rent income ratios of around the 30% mark. Shades of green and blue show suburbs that are relatively more affordable to the local population, and shades of orange and red show less affordable suburbs. So the predominant picture looks to be one of affordable rents for typical families across most of Perth Metro. But the picture changes remarkably when you look at the lower level of rental affordability for people on low incomes seeking lower price point rental properties within their suburbs. So this map just blows me away, and not in a great way. There are very few suburbs across Perth Metro that are comfortably affordable for people on low incomes. Hardly any suburbs have rental cost burdens below 30% for those on the lowest income levels, and on the contrary, rent income ratios are well above 30% for a far greater number of suburbs across Fremantle, Claremont, Hamilton Hill and the university suburbs of Bentley and Crawley. And we get very similar patterns when comparing the rental affordability of multi-residential units. So for us, this exposes a real economic and social issue for the state and a huge risk to single and low-income families, given that rents are tipped to rise further in 2021, but with incomes slow to follow. We need to deliver affordable rental housing at large scale, and to do so, our report calls for an effective replacement for the National Rental Affordability Scheme. If we don't act, there's a very real risk that more Western Australian families will face severe rental stress into the future. Now, rents are generally more affordable in most regional areas of the state, but there are a few important exceptions to the rule, especially in the resource-intensive regional towns of Karratha and Port Hedland, to a degree in Busselton and Bunbury, and in Broome. And this latter is of particular concern to Indigenous and lower socioeconomic status families in Broome who face serious challenges in accessing rental properties. The lucrative vacation rental market is just adding more to these pressures, and this is a big social issue for the Kimberley and one that needs to be resolved to mitigate the risks of driving more people in these regions towards homelessness. So now, let's look at how the WA housing market has moved over the course of COVID-19. And as we do, we're going to pay some particular attention to those seeking to enter the housing market for the first time. The growth in dwelling approvals in WA has been exceptional, with nearly 11,000 new houses and units approved between January and April of 2021. That's more than twice the number over the first 4 months of 2020. And many of these new approvals were to people buying property for the first time. And of course, more dwelling approvals translates to more housing loan commitments. Housing loans in WA reached a historic peak in February 2021, with around $2.4 billion in loans allocated to the housing sector. That's twice the value of the previous year. Now, we're just starting to come off that peak, with housing loans to owner-occupiers falling by $123 million in March and by a further $180 million in April. This is the first time that the value of home loans has dropped since Home Builder and the building bonus measures were announced. But of course, we're still very well ahead of the 10-year average. Home loans to WA's investors has progressively increased in value since the second half of 2020, up to $452 million now in April 2021. And of course, this rise has no doubt been bolstered by low interest rates, the housing stimulus measures, but also a returning confidence to investors in the WA housing market. More than 22,000 new housing loans were granted to first home buyers in WA in the 10 months between July 2020 and April 2021. That's nearly double the number of first home buyer loans compared to the equivalent period of the previous year. And in fact, more home loans were offered to first home buyers than non-first home buyers in each month from August last year to January 2021 of this year. This is the first time we've seen first home buyers receive a greater share of new home loans since the time of the First Home Owners Boost in 2009. Interestingly, neither the building bonus nor the home builder schemes make specific provisions for first home buyers alone, but when you add this to the First Homeowners Grant Scheme, the combination of supports have clearly incentivised more first home buyers to enter the market. And Amity, what do these first home buyers seek for the properties that they're moving into, and what barriers do they face?
Thanks, Alan. The survey found that the decision to purchase a first home revolved less around the financial issues and more around that sense of home, although there are differences depending on when people purchased. In terms of government help into home ownership, around half the first home buyer respondents considered the first home ownership grant as important to their purchasing decision. Almost half of those who purchased in the last 6 months said that government incentives allowed them to bring forward their decision to purchase. And this is compared to 26% of those who bought their home around 5 years ago. And 43% of those purchasing in the last 2 years stated that they would not have been able to buy without the incentives. For those who haven't purchased a home, the main barrier to home ownership remains the deposit, with 70% of potential purchasers citing this as the biggest issue. Schemes which help first home buyers to save, such as the First Home Super Saver scheme, and lower the deposit gap, such as Key Start and the New Home Guarantee, are an effective way to help first home buyers into the market. Stamp duty relief reduces savings required to enter into the home ownership market as well. Now this year, the survey included an open-ended question, asking first home buyers about what they wish they had known before they purchased their first home. Respondents commented that they wish they had known how to navigate the housing market, that they'd had more knowledge about mortgage products, that they had a better understanding of the true cost of purchasing and running a home, and how their changing household circumstances over time would change their housing needs. Back to you, Alan.
So the survey makes clear that while housing affordability has improved for many, those in rental housing are still feeling financial pressure. So what's driving these challenges? Well, it's true that Perth rents have become progressively more affordable since their peak in 2012, at least until recently. But affordability pressures for renters have ramped up considerably over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Rental vacancies in Perth are now at an all-time low, dropping to below 1% for the first time. And this is unusual if you compare Perth with the three other main capitals of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. Weekly median rents for houses in Perth have risen by a typical $20 in each of the 3 quarters from September 2020 through to March 2021. That's a combined increase of $60 over 9 months. And the story is substantially the same for units. Now, the extent to which this trend can be reversed depends upon a number of factors, not least of which is to address the tightness of the rental market and punishingly low vacancy rates of less than 1%. The combination of financial incentives for new dwelling purchases, low interest rates and growing confidence amongst investors will certainly ease supply constraints to a degree, but newly built homes will take some time to enter the market, and in the meantime, the end of the rental moratorium and limited rental vacancies could well push rents up further, at least in the shorter term. And how might continued low rental vacancy rates affect rents over the next year in WA? Well, looking to the past can give us some insights into what we might expect over the next 6 to 12 months. So this is a stylized version of a chart in our report that plots vacancy rates on the horizontal against median rents on the vertical over different phases of WA's business cycle. So vacancy rates tightened to less than 1% over the course of WA's boom time, from 2003 to 2007, at the same time that excess demand for rental housing drove rents higher. The global financial crisis led to higher rental vacancies, but rents interestingly held fairly constant over the GFC period. Vacancy rates fell progressively as WA's economy grew post-GFC, with rents being pushed upwards once vacancy rates dipped below 2%. The economic slowdown in WA between 2013 and 16 saw median rent listings fall gradually from around $450 to $350 for a typical property, and vacancy rates rise to over 6%. And rents remained pretty stable from 2016 up to the start of the pandemic. At the same time, vacancy rates fell from 7% down to around 2%. And this was likely due to the lack of supply of rental housing to meet the needs of WA's growing population. But the worry now, with vacancy rates falling further since the start of COVID-19, is that rents will continue to increase in the same fashion as before. In many ways, this puts us in a red zone of rising rents when vacancy rates are below 2%. And we expect this to continue at least over the next 6 months until supply constraints relax. Amity.
Thanks, Alan. One of the things that we looked at through the survey were the changes that were brought about through the 2019 pandemic period. One of the things that we asked our respondents was has the pandemic changed the way that you worked? 42% of respondents said that yes, it did, with working from home being the biggest change that they experienced. So what does this mean for the housing market and the decisions that people make around their home and where they want to live? We asked respondents if the pandemic had changed what they wanted from their dwelling, and 20% indicated that it had. The findings were quite similar between private renters and those owning with a mortgage. Outright owners were least affected by this item. To understand the impact of COVID-19 on housing preferences, we looked at the dwelling and location features that respondents would be unwilling to compromise on, and then compared them to our 2019 findings, which you see in the brackets on the screen there. What this slide shows us is that WA households are now less willing to compromise on some specific dwelling features, for example, the type of dwelling that they live in. The biggest increase is an unwillingness to compromise on the number of bedrooms, with 30% fewer respondents now flexible on this attribute. These changes reflect the need for space in the home, and that good quality internal housing design is becoming increasingly important, particularly as households are working from home more often. If we turn to the neighbourhood preferences on the bottom half of the screen, the results show us that demand for easy access to shops is another area where respondents are now less willing to compromise. So what this starts to show us is that there is evidence that COVID-19 has changed what some people, at least, want from their housing. The survey then went further and asked those respondents who indicated that the COVID-19 pandemic had changed what they wanted from their housing about how it had changed. And what we found was that 40% of renters wanted to own their own house or own home as a result of their COVID-19 experiences. 40% of owners and 30% of renters wanted more outdoor space, and around a third of all owners and renters wanted more indoor space. So what does this mean for housing policy? On the basis of these findings, our report puts forward a number of specific recommendations, including increased investment in social housing, financial support for private renters, increased financial support for groups delivering affordable housing, and reforms to the Commonwealth rent assistance. However, in our view, a long-term goal should be the structural reform of the housing system to ensure that it delivers a secure housing opportunity for all. We need to rethink our current policy settings around tax, housing subsidies and housing supply, with the end goal of delivering affordable housing to households across the income spectrum. Without such reform, the gap between households who can and cannot access home ownership will grow, delivering increasingly inequitable outcomes with negative economic repercussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Amity and to Alan. And Alan's making his way to the seat in the centre, which is appropriate. Please join me in welcoming the remainder of the panel. Mr Mike Rowe, Director-General, Department of Communities. Michelle McKenzie, Chief Executive Officer, Shelter WA. John Curtin, Distinguished Professor. Alan Duncan's already here. Kath Hart, Executive Director, Housing Industry Association, and another co-author of the report, Professor Stephen Rowley from the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. Welcome. And thank you as well for the Slido questions, which are coming in thick and fast as Kath joins us. So I'm going to proceed from my left and then further left. And I want to start with you, Mike Rowe. The report, and thank you to Alan and to Amity for presenting a very thought-provoking and comprehensive. I think everyone's got some insights there in their own industries, so please keep those questions coming through on Slido. But Mike, the report notes that while housing affordability has improved for many households, it's not true across the board. Your department clearly has a big role to play when it comes to affordable housing. Is there anything more that government can do in the rental sector for those people who can't take advantage of the subsidies that are available for new home buyers and home builders?
That is a good question, and not one that I came prepared for, actually, to be honest. I had something else entirely prepared. It was a bit awkward. Ask me again.
Well, government has, both state and federal,
Yep.
they've thrown money at people who are wanting to build houses to stimulate jobs.
Correct.
There's a big market of renters
Correct.
who are out there. They can't take advantage of that directly. Maybe it is that they eventually benefit with more housing supply.
Yes.
Is there anything that is a policy lever that can be done to assist particularly renters and low-income people?
Well, I guess, so acknowledging that the Commonwealth already play a role in that space, and as Alan said, there's opportunity for the Commonwealth to be sort of boosting their interest in that area. Certainly when it comes to the end of the moratorium period, the state already has a sort of a support program there for those people who might be struggling in that period between when the moratorium comes to an end, which it has, but also, till hopefully the situation eases more generally for renters as in the next 6-month period as stuff comes off. Beyond that, I think that our main focus is really to try and encourage more stock into the market, which obviously government, as you said, both Commonwealth and state have subsidised a lot of that activity, and we're starting to see that material, come online slowly but surely. Beyond that, I don't have any particular insights for you that I can offer, which is a bit embarrassing, really, so I'm sorry about that one. Hopefully I'll perform better next time. Yeah, please, Michelle probably has some great ideas.
I bet you do, Michelle. And
it's only day 18, can I say I'm sorry?
It's early days. Michelle, that report does point to greater affordability for those owner-occupiers, but the rental market finding it tough, especially single parents. What are the network of housing providers as well as your clients, the people that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, what are they telling you?
Yeah, so many of our members are here today and they're seeing families and individuals in acute housing stress, people that they've never seen before coming in contact with services, finding that they're getting evicted and they can't find an affordable home to live. Their rent has gone up so much that they're spending all of their discretionary payments onto the rent and they can't afford food and other things. So individuals and families across the state in acute housing stress, and there are no housing options. So homelessness is increasing, people are living in their cars, people are moving in with families and friends, it's not safe. Women facing situations of family and domestic violence cannot leave, they cannot find an affordable home. We've got children in situations that are unsafe because families are overcrowded. Routines are absolutely upset, kids going to school. It's really dire, and I want to congratulate for the report highlighting the impact on renters.
If I can just follow up on that, it does seem that there's a bit of a crunch, that the moratorium perhaps has accelerated this all happening all at once. Do you think, and we know that the moratorium was brought in for the very best of reasons, but has there been an unintended consequence here? Do you think that some of these issues might have been spread out over 12 months, if I can put it that way, but they're all concentrated all at the same time when everyone's scrambling at the same time that landlords are taking the opportunity to jack up their rents?
So there have always been people in acute housing
Yes.
stress. Today we've got over 17,000 households on the social housing wait list. The moratorium has highlighted that to people who perhaps weren't aware of the housing issues, and it's impacting on them now. Picking up on what Mike's point was, the government's done some good things like the residential relief grant scheme, but we need to address the families that are falling between the cracks, and we need to have emergency relief funding now. So if somebody walks into Anglicare or Uniting WA and they need support to pay their rent, that they can get that support. We do not want anyone else being homeless. And if people are being evicted, we need to rapidly find good accommodation options, because we do not want people living in tents. You know, we're better than that. And so there are things government can do. And of course, increase investment in social housing, thank you, and build on the strengths of the community housing sector, who can provide a really great affordable rental product and a social housing product.
I want to come back to those big investments in social housing later in this discussion, because it's something I've been hearing for at least 10 years, but no one seems to have cracked the nut yet. Alan Duncan, we know that there's been a major surge in building activity. I don't think many people would have anticipated that in March last year. Is it too much for the economy to handle?
Look, I mean, it is certainly the case that there's been a lot of energy injected into the housing market, and you know, the combined impact of the stimulus measures for people seeking new home purchases. You know, it's been a good thing, and for many, it's lowered the barrier to entry into the housing market. But of course, with that level of stimulus, you know, it's going to inject activity with a range of consequences, and we've seen that as we saw in the report through the sort of lifting of the purchase price and of property, and also more particularly the impact on rents. We know that there are challenges and skill shortages in construction to meet this huge excess demand for property, and so clearly it's imposing sort of challenges on the sector to deliver those demands, and as we discuss in the medium term, as those extra properties come on stream, that will ease the situation. So we are very much in that transitional phase at the moment, but I think that's sort of very clear in the conversations that we're having now.
And in Talkback land, where I reside, we are regularly contacted by people who say, listen, my slab went down 6 months ago and nothing has happened since. And it was something that smart, connected people in the industry did warn about with the design of some of these schemes, is that when you put a deadline on it, there's a rush to meet the deadline. And so people do what they can to meet the deadline. That is substantial completion to get the grant, which means you find someone to lay a slab and you lay it, and then you worry about putting the walls and the roof up later. Kath Hart, what are some of those major roadblocks to satisfying those strong levels of demand, actually getting the houses built?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, in the Housing Industry Association, certainly we have had a lot of conversations about, which is that there's kind of a real bottleneck at the top of that pipeline. In WA, it's bricklayers. I know there's some students here today. If you're looking at career options, interested in getting out on site, come and see me after, because
they'll take you today.
We'll take you this afternoon. Yep, we've got BGC here, ABN here. They're looking for people to do some good pre-apps. But bricklaying has been the challenge in WA For many, many years, pre-COVID, we were struggling to get enough people. In COVID, we saw this huge surge in demand, and I think that's at the top of the kind of the life cycle of a residential construction. So that's kind of a real bottleneck that slows everything down. Some of our members report that the build times now from a dwelling start, which is, get the slab down, to a completion has now doubled. So when we talk about our stats in terms of how many dwelling commencements there are, one of the things we've been emphasising is that previously that would have converted into a shelter for an individual and their family, whereas now, in about kind of 12 months, now that's more like 18 to 24 months. So that's another, I suppose, change in the activity in the market that we're seeing. In Western Australia, it's really been that we were coming off such a prolonged downturn, 5 to 6 years of very low levels of activity, which saw basically the labour base of our industry effectively winnowed out. People went to, took other jobs in the mining sector, and we feel that many of those people were lost to the industry for good. And so then to have a kind of massive surge in volume, and then we saw a 211% increase in new home sales from the months that the grants were announced.
So any industry would struggle to adapt with that surge in demand.
Exactly, and not having.
If you're growing tomatoes, you're going to struggle to plant enough.
It's not. It's not organic growth, is it?
Right.
It's overnight historic low to an historic high, and that's kind of created this kind of key issue around labour constraints, and that is kind of, I think, the biggest blocker.
Just on that, and before I go to Stephen, the point that you made about bricklayers is one I want to pick up on, because it's not the only way you can build a house. You don't need to build double brick. There are other ways of doing it, and they are done other ways in different states. And this is not a new question, but I've never quite cracked the answer. Why is it that the market hasn't responded to that shortage and gone to other ways of doing things, other methods of construction? Is that because that's not what consumers want? Is it because that's the way we do business here?
It's a fantastic question, and I've joked that it has taken a global pandemic to shake Western Australians' love of double brick, but it is actually happening. We are seeing some builders now moving to more framed construction, and consumers are embracing that. Previously, the West Australian psyche had a kind of adoration of double brick. For West Australians, I come from Queensland, where we build on stilts with wood, which regularly get blown over. But in the West, very sturdy brick construction has kind of resonated with the community. Now, though, when our builders talk to consumers and say, because of these challenges in terms of supply, would you look at framed construction, steel framed construction in particular? And people are saying yes. We had one example where a builder went to, I think, 140 of their clients and said, would you consider moving from double brick to framed construction for these projects? They thought a success rate would be, if they had a 30-40% conversion, 70% of the people said, yep, we're in. The difference is that they'll get in sooner.
Right, because it means I can get in my house by Christmas instead of by the middle of next year.
Exactly.
Okay, there you go. Stephen Rowley, one of the authors of the report. The question I'm about to ask you, and if you actually get this right, then you win the whole shooting match, okay? But everyone's been looking at housing policy for a long time. Affordability has always seemingly been an issue. I mean, I think there are some encouraging signs from this report about affordability, though not for everyone, as Michelle would remind us. But is there one thing we could do to fix housing affordability permanently?
Thanks for that.
He wins it.
I wish it were that simple. We're not alone in Australia in battling with our housing market. I mean, our market's dominated by home ownership across the world is struggling with affordability, and we don't often ask what we actually want from our housing market. I mean, my view, a successful housing market is one where a median, household on a median income can afford comfortably a median-priced house. And there are also options for people on lower incomes as well to buy. And the private rental sector is one that offers safe and secure housing for households across the income spectrum. And then we have a very substantial social housing network that would really support those who are vulnerable and falling out of ownership or the private rental sector. So that's where we've got to get to. But that really, as Amity mentioned in the presentation, requires a complete structural reform of our housing market. And the question is, what government is going to want to take that on? Because ultimately it requires house prices to fall, which is not a politically comfortable position.
No one's won an election on it yet.
No, and you won't do until the proportion of private renters is higher than the proportion of owners. And
which is a public policy outcome you probably don't want.
Yeah, we are moving in that direction, but it's going to take some time. So there are things you can do, certainly tax reform. You've got some tax reform that certainly have negative affordability outcomes. You've got other taxes that there are barriers to ownership, where you've got real issues there about demand side stuff. On the supply side, it's very difficult for the housing industry to bring on a low-cost housing product because of the cost of regulation, but also the cost of land, and that cost of land is a function of established prices. So you've got all these structural impediments to affordable housing, and so it becomes essential for government to do more in the space, particularly when it comes to social housing. It's all very well having these various schemes that really just allowing people to bring forward their decision to get into home ownership, households that are likely to have got into home ownership anyway. So really government, if it's not going to go through with that massive structural reform, need to be supporting the bottom end of that market and providing housing for people that really are struggling to enter and stay in the private market.
So there's about 9 questions I now have from that response, and there's Slido questions I want to get to as well. But just as a bit of a sort of a, this is like what's that ink blot? Is that called a Rorschach test? Is that what it's called? Something like that? Well, this isn't really a question, it's sort of a statement. I want to get your responses to it. But there's an intergenerational component to this whole debate as well, and a rather glaring one. If I talk to my old man about it, right, who's the baby boomer generation and now retired, he says, well, look, it's all right for you. You've got a home mortgage under 3%, whereas we paid 19% at times for our home mortgages. And I say, yeah, but Dad, you bought your house for $75,000 and it's now worth 1 point whatever it's worth. I can actually see it from both points of view, because he'll say, well, I didn't get paid very much and that house was, worth X times my salary. And I say the same thing, well, my house is worth more than X times my salary. He says, yeah, but you pay less for your mortgage. So here's the question, what's affordable? Is it the value of the home compared to how much you're earning? Is it the value of servicing the debt from the good people at Bankwest who've been taking a punt on you that you're good for the money?
The cost of servicing the mortgage is not the biggest issue at the moment. It's actually breaking into home ownership in the first place.
So it's getting the deposit.
That deposit. And so that's different. $1 million house compared to a $70,000 house, you need a $200,000 deposit. So it's actually saving for that. And of course, when you've got no money left over at the end of the month because your rent's too high, how do you break into ownership? So things like Key Start help because they reduce that deposit requirement. So those are positive things governments can do. But yeah, of course, if we do get a situation where mortgage interest rates rise, by 2 or 3%, whenever that may happen over time, then we're going to see very different affordability challenges.
I can see Mike itching to get involved in that.
Well, I need to point to our good colleagues over there at Key Start who are exactly in the market for that reason. And so I've learnt in my 18 days that there's a thing called a housing continuum, and that government has an opportunity to do all sorts of things in terms of the levers that are available to it. And there's one point of the continuum where people are moving from potentially rental to private home ownership, and to make that more accessible to people, then subsidised deposits is one way to do that, or reduce deposits. And our team at Key Start do an amazing job and have done for many years. I think it was a West Australian innovation that's now adopted nationally, and that really does help a portion of the people who are in the market actually get into the market. They don't stay there for a long time. It's designed like that. They move out of the Key Start environment reasonably quickly. So there are some good opportunities around to help people get into that space.
Michelle, what does affordability mean to you?
It's where you're not paying so much of your income on your rent or your mortgage that you can actually afford to live. But I think we also need to sit back and think, why in Europe do people rent? So we've got this aspiration for home ownership, which is great, but not all people will be able to afford their home. So we need to have really good affordable rentals through the community housing providers, but we also need Residential Tenancy Act that enables people to rent and have safe, secure tenure. What's happening at the moment is nuts. People are being evicted, that they cannot find anywhere else to live because the current Residential Tenancy Act does not support renters. So I think we need to have a variety of products. Some people want to buy, some people might want to rent for life, and some people will always need social housing, and it's just appalling that we've got that safety net broken and 17,000 people waiting for a social home, living in private rentals that they can't afford, or living in a tent, or living in their car.
And just before I go to the rest of the panel for their answer to that previous question, because it has come through on the slide, and I think is a good jumping off point. Perhaps, Mike, you're not a politician and I'm not asking you to speak for them, but there is a question through on the Slido. Is there any clarity on when we'll see reform to the Residential Tenancies Act to improve rights for renters?
You know, that's A, I'm not a politician, and B, it's not even my portportfolio, so that's not something I can comment on. That happens in the commerce area.
Well dodged. We'll ask a politician at a future event.
Yeah.
Ring them up on Talkback Radio.
That's right.
133 882. Yeah. Kath, what's affordable?
Oh, look, I just wanted to add a comment on that to Stephen's point around what is it that we want houses to be. Like in the Australian psyche, it's not just actually, home ownership is not just about shelter. It is often around this is the biggest investment you'll make, to your conversation with your old man. The idea, and to your point about why governments aren't going to win an election by getting house prices to fall, is that Australians build and buy homes hoping that they will improve in value, and that will be their big nest egg over their lifetime. And I think it's an important point to make in terms of there's a different driver for those people. Those people who then get some equity may become investors in housing stock that they will rent out to people. But if we have policy settings where we discourage investment, where people have accumulated some wealth and want to put that back into the housing market, we will perversely have less stock for the people whose kind of first order need around shelter isn't kind of being adequately met.
A question from Slido to anyone who'd like to pick it up. It is a lack of diversity in product choice driving the lower quartile rental red and orange maps that Alan and Amity showed earlier? And it's an interesting point, and there's a lot to say about diversity of housing types, because the mantra for as long as I've been covering these issues, which is probably a decade and a half, has been that we need more housing choice, we need right for life cycle and lifestyle housing choice. We need more apartments, we need higher density. But what I also observe is, and again, it's a stage of life thing, the traditional large suburban blocks that many people in this room grew up playing in the back of do not exist anymore at an affordable price for most people. They've been sliced and diced, and whole swathes of what were once beautiful suburbia have now been subdivided into 3 and 4 townhouses. And I don't need to say the suburbs, but they are all over, and partly that's individual landowners building that nest egg that Kath's talking about. Do we have a diversity of housing type problem, do you think?
Well, Kath and Steve will have far more things to say about this, but yeah, that analysis of the asymmetry in the housing market just strikes us as extraordinary. There's something wrong when the housing market is not able to, in a balanced way, deliver affordable houses to people across the income spectrum at the right price point and the right location. And so, clearly the supply issue, must be working against that capacity to even up levels of affordability across the spectrum. And yeah, in terms of diversity, it seems very clear that a broader range of housing options that can deliver those right price point properties where people want to live, relative to their incomes, has to be the priority. But I don't know what the solution is.
Oh, look, and I'd say it's where planning reform also becomes kind of quite pertinent to affordability, as well as kind of other regulatory settings. I mean, 33% of the cost of a house is taxes, fees and charges. So that goes to affordability. There's some changes on foot at the moment being considered in terms of medium density, and also the National Construction Code new version for 2022, which, for my sins I read. There's changes contemplated in that, which would effectively consume every dollar that a consumer received in combined grants, that is the federal grant and the state grant. Just in mandatory requirements, in 7-star ratings and things like that. So there's lots of things that we ask builders to put into houses. There's lots of requirements we have in terms of planning, in terms of you must have these kinds of setbacks in a blanket sense, which add cost to property that just make them not commercial. So, there's no margin in it. They're not going to get built. We're not going to get that kind of product. And I think we have seen a big shift that not all consumers want you know, the big block and the backyard. And we see, and my colleagues here from Property Council and UDIA, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about this, where, you know, we've got, you know, elderly West Australians rattling around in large houses because they can't kind of right-size to get something that's more suitable to their, not only to their needs and lifestyle, but to their ability to maintain that house. So, you know, we have a lot of these regulatory settings in place that do prevent people moving out and kind of freeing up that dwelling stock.
I was just going to add, it's not just the cost of the home, it's the cost of running the home and the cost of living. So if I think about changes to the National Construction Code, they might make houses more accessible. So over somebody's life, it's great to have an accessible home. It might make homes more climate friendly, so you don't spend as much on your power and your water. So I think we need to be careful when we talk about codes and regulation, what the intent is and what the outcome, not just on affordable purchase, but the cost of operating
It's
the
interesting
home.
though, in the survey, I think it said like that 18% of consumers, and it was down from 20%, wanted those universal provisions. And I think consumers understand that drives cost for them as well. And I mean, I guess, and also I suppose maybe it's a Queensland thing, but I've seen so many examples of people where, you know, they've got kind of a house that meets all the energy requirements and is the top star rating, and they'll run the air conditioning with the doors and windows wide open.
So maybe that's an educational opportunity.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think the survey did show that the biggest driver of housing choice is affordability first and location second. The other dwelling-specific features were quite a long way down that decision-making criteria. So housing choice and different housing options are absolutely essential. But there are barriers. Community backlash is one of them, certainly. But there are also economic barriers as well. Certain types of housing product are just not financially feasible in certain types of areas. You just don't have the underlying economic value to support the high cost of construction. So, you know, absolutely essential that we get better quality housing outcomes within our infill areas. But we need to understand that there is that very fine line between something that's feasible for a developer to make their return and something that isn't feasible, and so you get no development at all. So a really difficult balancing act. It's a challenge that, you know, the Department of Planning are grappling with at the moment.
Just a bit of a segue that may or may not make sense, but in terms of the question, the issue around diversity and typology, Minister Carey, who's our housing minister, is absolutely fixated on the challenge around social housing at the moment and doing what we can to bring forward that and kind of build a lot more as quickly as we can. And so he's very exercised about the opportunity to do things differently, away from the traditional building styles and different forms and typologies. So that's something that we are actively looking at. And I know it's not quite the question, but the point is, and I think Kath made it before, if the pandemic's helped us shift away from an expectation about brick and tile or whatever it is, then I think the government's pretty keen to understand what we could do differently, particularly in the social housing space, to get some innovation in that area as well.
I do want to come back to social housing in just a moment, so that's where we'll take it right after this, because the students from St Andrews Grammar School are here. And this is the one, and I'm not joking, guys, at the back there from St Andrews Grammar, this is the one that has all of my panellists up here the most terrified. They're like, what are the kids going to ask? I said, you'll just have to wait and see.
So with today's growing societal expectations for the younger generation to go to universities to get a degree and obtain material possessions at an early age, this puts us under pressure to fulfill these expectations. As a result, we are left with a great sum of student debt and personal debt that we have to pay off, leaving us at a significant disadvantage in regards to our abilities to afford simple homes. So I'd like to ask, what can the government do to help support us as a future generation to be able to cope with the issue of housing affordability in midst of these expectations, and how can that help to prevent young people from being priced out of the market?
It's a great question. I think Kath's itching to answer it.
Look, I think the first issue is to have a... Sorry.
After you.
I think the first thing to have is a stable and secure private rental sector. So you've got somewhere where it's affordable and you can start to build your savings. It will help pay off your debt. and then put you in a situation where you can actually afford to go into home ownership. So if you don't have an affordable private rental sector, you're behind the eight ball from the start. You can't save, you can't put yourself in a position to move up the housing ladder. So that's the thing that I would like to see put in place, that we really do have that safety, security, that affordable private rental sector.
Kath?
I would say future bricklayers, that you end up with student debt when you go to university. But if you consider vocational pathways, you can earn while you learn. And I don't just mean in the construction sector, but I do think that there is a culture in, you know, that I've certainly felt, and I know, you know, others in the room as well, where, you know, the expectation is that you'll finish at your private school and you'll go to university. But I would say to you that you should look at vocational opportunities as well, because you can be earning from day one, and the pathways aren't just to becoming a carpenter or a bricklayer, for instance, in residential construction. It's around being the owner of your own business and somebody who can eventually create jobs and employment opportunities for other people. So I'd say that, you know, it's in addition to the kind of housing supply issue, there's some training and vocational training opportunities that we don't value as much as we really should. And I would say if we did value them as much as we should, we wouldn't have a massive shortage of trades in this state.
Can I just add to what Stephen said there, that it feels to me in the real world that unless you're, and you talked about stable, affordable rentals, that increasingly that means mum and dad's house, and that the deposit means some of mum and dad's equity from their own home. So we come back to intergenerational questions, which is great if mum and dad have done well, but that's not true of everyone. So what are the levers? What are the options? Are you, I don't want to say condemned to a lifetime, because that's not the right choice of words, but is lifelong renting the only alternative in this current market where median house prices, like, I don't know how anyone does it in New South Wales, but here in Perth, you know, we're more affordable, but less affordable than we used to be. If you don't have the backing of parents, realistically, if you're trying to study, trying to pay private rental market rates, plus keep a roof over your head, plus maybe just go to the pub for one beer a week, how do you put it all together realistically in this environment?
So the other, yeah, it's tough. I understand that. The thing that I failed to answer with that dismal response to that first question you gave me was just to also point out that the state does provide bond assistance, subsidies to people. So if they're struggling to get a rental, there's that opportunity as well to help them in. And I think ultimately, if you're on the path that Steve's outlined and you're in a position to save, then when it comes time to actually want to move on and buy a house, then potentially Keystart's there to help, and they do a good job of doing so. So there are those pathways, but I get it is pretty tough for lots of people in the rental environment right now.
And Keystart's quite unique, not just in Australia, but also in the world. So we are, in a kind of quite a fortunate position in that we have these extra levers across the housing continuum to help people get in. But the deposit gap, I mean, it is the number one issue, and the bank of mum and dad. Yeah, if it's not flush with cash, it is really, really challenging.
But we've got to ask ourselves, why is there a stigma about being a long-term renter?
Yes, and that's why I caught myself with that choice of phrase, because it's not the right way to think about it.
It's just not the case in other countries. If we had a well-structured private rental sector, which with rental tenancy legislation that allowed you to stay in place and treat it like your home, we wouldn't have this obsession with ownership.
So the segue then to the social housing discussion, which is to me the elephant in the room, because everyone's been talking about it. Money's never been cheaper. Governments have never had more appetite to take on debt. Why don't they just borrow $1 billion per state, whatever it is, and go, here we go, we're going to build it. And we don't care if it doesn't make a return for 50 years because we're the government and it's part of what we do. And we'll contract out the running of it to our best service providers if that's what the policy is. I'm not a policy expert. I'm just wondering why this is so hard to do effectively at scale.
I don't understand. You look at Victoria, $5 billion investment into new social homes. Queensland budget, $2 billion. So we've got a $5 billion surplus. We know it costs more to support people who are experiencing homelessness, or to support people that are in hospital because they can't be discharged, because they can't find a home for people. So it's nuts. Again, I think the government needs to bite the bullet and to accelerate the rate of their current investment into social homes. Over the last 3 years, we've lost over 1,000 social homes. Current government investment will deliver 870 new homes. We're still going backwards.
What's the waiting list at the
What an
moment?
opportunity. Over 17,000 households, so that's about 34,000 people, of which about 3,000 are on the priority wait list, who can wait for a year. So these are people in acute stress, waiting a year to get a home. So what an opportunity for economic and social productivity. And I was in the Pilbara a couple of weeks ago. You've got regions where small business people can't get homes, key workers can't get homes, you can't get childcare because the workers can't afford anywhere to live. It's really putting the brakes on our society. And investment in social housing, Michael, brilliant, let's do it.
So yes, I mean...
Yes, let's have a big round of applause for Mike Rowe, new DG.
Well, no pressure. Yeah, so look...
Everyone tells you how to do the job when you start, so here you go.
That's right, I'm still listening, got my listening ears on. So, look, the state does have an active social housing investment program on the back of COVID in particular. That was sort of boosted by around about $500 million, so there's a lot of money being invested into it. Yes, there's a lot of calls for more. And as I said before, Minister Carey in particular is very exercised about what can be done to increase the amount of social housing in this state and to reduce the waiting list. So that's his two major objectives as the Housing Minister. At the whole of government level, he's supported by other ministers in both the lands and the planning portfolio. So I reread your pre-election submission last night actually, Michelle, and you talked about, let's try and maximise the opportunity for existing government land out there. Let's bring forth those sort of opportunities. So that ministerial committee meets every fortnight. There's supported by Directors General Group who meet pretty frequently. So we are really pretty exercised as a state government to try and look at what might be possible. Of course, I can't comment on what future budget outcomes might be because that's a few months off in any event, but there is a lot of effort into that space. However, we are competing with the same market that others are in terms of getting stuff done. So there's that sort of challenge. The other thing that's available to government, though, to go to Kath's point about and to Alan's and others' point, we are in this stage where we'll see a bit of a peak of construction, where all the government stimulus will wash through. And I think one of the other things the government will be interested in doing is making sure that there's a smooth pipeline of investment so that all of a sudden all of our well-equipped tradies and others actually have something to get on with. So balancing out the immediate requirement to get that social housing done, which is of course a focus, plus the longer-term smoothing of that pipeline is going to be important. And there's plenty of other stuff we can do as well. So the opportunity to work more closely with the community housing sector to look at opportunities and levers that might be available. So all options are on the table. The government's pretty exercised on it, and we're busy trying to meet both the initial target, which Exhibit A in our housing strategy. If you've got a close up on that, it's a good read for anybody. Is a net 6% increase by 2030. Now, some would argue that's probably not enough. But nevertheless, it is our minister's top priority. So,
but you've preemptively answered a question that I wanted to get to, which is what we can do about the cliff that may be coming if the private activity drops off. So that is interesting. The government actively thinking, I'm taking from it to support those jobs with public investment when the private investment tails off. Crowd participation time. I want you to think about first homeowners grants, and I'm going to give you two options. I want you to put your hand up. Okay. Do you believe that first homeowner grants make houses more affordable? Put your hand up. Do you believe that first homeowner grants make houses more expensive?
No.
That's a really interesting answer. I'm in the latter camp, and so the question that I want to come to is how can we assist first homeowners without pushing prices up?
Me? Sure.
It's like I farted in an elevator.
I didn't want to interrupt you this time.
Oh, no, go.
No, please.
Sure. We're just having a polite... First homeowners, I would say that one of the big drivers around costs at the moment has been the labour shortages. And to go, I was thinking about what you're saying in terms of the cliff. I'm sure everyone would have seen on the newspaper last week or so, CME, the Chamber of Minerals and Energy, saying that they expect they need another 40,000 people to come and work in the resources sector. That doesn't sound like a cliff if that happens. It sounds like an even more challenging housing availability issue. So I kind of think, one of the most fundamental things we need to do in terms of availability to kind of get back to equilibrium in terms of the market would be around labour, and I know the government's very exercised on this. The pitch that I would make and what I would say is very important is around the sequencing. So the mining sector, our extractive industries that make our state so unique, have their hand up to say we need more workers to come in. I would say unless they bring tents and caravans, that they should get in line, and we need to bring in a skilled workforce for the residential construction sector to kind of take some of that pressure out of the market so that we have stock for all these wonderful new West Australians who are going to come and work in our big miners.
All right. And on to, go on.
I was just going to say it's a supply and demand issue. So if we've got enough supply, then the market will correct. So let's have more social housing. Let's have more affordable rental homes. Let's have more affordable homes for purchase in the right locations that are diverse and meet people's needs. And once you've got that, then you don't need to potentially provide those first home owner grants because the supply's there. So
not to be too down on politicians, but that's sort of what I do for a living. But it's a great thing to announce at budget time or at election time, isn't it? Oh, we're going to give $50,000 to first homeowners, and who doesn't want to own a home? But the consensus, it's your industry, the consensus seems to be it's counterproductive. So how do we wean governments off it and do something different? Any thoughts?
One thing I've thought about for many years is we talk about inclusionary zoning, and obviously the industry don't like that because it impacts on feasibility, but you don't just need to provide social housing or public housing within inclusionary zoning. You could actually provide a certain proportion of first home buyer dwellings, so that sale is restricted to a first home buyer. That would keep prices down and on sale to other first home buyers. So it's a provision of direct product to first home buyers rather than chucking money at people, which does push prices up. Actually having a product that's specific to a particular group of purchases is one way to do it. But I think we do need to do something for first home buyers because that barrier, that access, that deposit, and we talked about Key Start already, and the government have a few schemes, but we do need to try and encourage people to free up stock from the private rental market to start with. But our retirement system is predicated on outright ownership, and until we have that structural reform again, we do have to assist people into that home ownership market.
So we've been incredibly disciplined and run perfectly on time right throughout this whole discussion. And at the risk of putting that in peril, because I'm having so much fun with this discussion, just your briefest answer as I just cover off on one more thing. And sorry if we couldn't get to your questions, but I think we've done a good job at getting across the spread of the issues. And it's picking up a little bit on what you've just said, Stephen, but I want to talk about the private investment, residential investment component of the market. Your briefest thought to each panellist on whether it is a desirable outcome for some owners to have 5 and 6 properties, one that they live in, 4 and 5 that they rent out. Is that a good thing or a bad thing when it comes to housing affordability? Go.
I'm going to say yes in principle.
I'm interested how the money flows and where the subsidy for purchasing those properties comes from.
If it adds to affordable housing stock for private renters, then yes.
I'd say, yeah, it contributes stock across the continuum. I'd say what we'll see in WA, what I'm hearing at the moment, is that investors, though, are selling those properties and to owner-occupiers. So we're going to see less rental stock. Watch this space.
Unless there's a replacement through institutional investment or government, you need mum and dad investors.
There you go. It's a great discussion. Please thank each of our panellists this afternoon. I hope you got something out of that. As I said, we could talk all day about it. It's a fascinating impact, and everyone's got an opinion whether you're in the industry or not, because we all fundamentally need a roof over our heads. And as many have observed, it's the most emotional as well as the biggest investment that most people will make in their lives. So thank you very much to all of our panellists. To deliver the vote of thanks, I want to introduce and welcome to the stage Tim Marnie, Chief Economist, of the Nous Group, Chair of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre Advisory Board. Tim, thank you.
Good afternoon all. Well, yet again, Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre delivers something that you absolutely cannot get from anywhere else. You get a focus on WA with bespoke data collection to provide very insightful analysis into WA-specific circumstance. And realistically, the Great Australian Dream means that housing affordability is never going to be far from the front page, and the fact that a safe and stable place to live is a fundamental determinant of well-being, both social and economic, makes that all the more important. We've heard about the tale of two tenures, the improved perceptions of affordability for homeowners, but not so for renters. Women consistently faring worse than men in particularly rental affordability. And if you're in the lower quartile income, you're in rental stress. And let's not forget, we opened with a welcome to country, and the Aboriginal income distribution is such that there is a higher concentration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in that lower quartile as well. What the report shows is that the pinch points in the system are more acute. What it also tells, though, when you read between the lines in the analysis and the discussion, is those pinch points are likely to get worse in the near future. And let's remember that the survey data was collected at a period in time when there was JobSeeker and JobKeeper in place. So income's not what they are today. Commencements of new homes have doubled. First home buyers are way up. But the outlook for rent and prices is looking up due to low vacancies, and that's going to be the case for some time because stock will not fix that overnight. And with COVID-19, we've heard that 20% of people have increased their relative preference for amenity over proximity of housing, which could fundamentally change the market over years to come. The actions, the calls to action from the report for increased social housing, and we heard from Mike Rowe, the Director General of the Department of Communities, that the Minister, in quotes, is fixated with increasing the social housing stock. I know for a fact that Mike feels that fixation on an hourly basis. Increased assistance to renters, increased support to social housing providers. We heard also Mike comment that that was something on his mind and on the government's mind, and reform of Commonwealth rent assistance. So, a very insightful discussion. I would like to thank Mike Rowe on day 18 of his new role as Director General, and commend him for actually agreeing to speak today, which he would have agreed to on about day 2, which was maybe a naive day or a brave day, one of the two. So thank you, Mike, very much for being with us. Thank you for sharing your views on social housing, on your assurance around smooth long-term transition and working with the community housing sector. Michelle McKenzie from Shelter WA pointed out to us that services are seeing people in acute housing stress they haven't seen before. And if there's one quote to take away from today's proceedings, the one that's ringing in my ears is Michelle's quote that people living in tents, we're better than that. We can do better than that. To Kath Hart, this is the big bad wolf state. We don't build houses out of straw and sticks. We use bricks. Thank you very much, Kath Hart, for your insights into the industry, incredibly valuable. And thank you to our Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre team in Alan, Duncan, Amity, James and Stephen Rowley. And lastly, thank you to 1338882, Gareth Parker, on the radio very early in the morning. It is late in the evening for him right now, so well done, Gareth, as always, in facilitating a provocative discussion. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you all for attending. Please, if you would like more insights, they are all available on the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre website, bcec.edu. That concludes our proceedings. We are exactly 2 minutes past time, so I reckon that's pretty good going, given all of the terrain that we've covered this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to stick around, meet, mingle, enjoy, discuss and chew over the discussion that we've had today. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you next time.